The NW plan, aka the New Weapons Plan, was first proposed 20 years ago. Despite being the person in charge of this project, I was not the one who first proposed this plan, nor did any other brilliant scientist. It was the man in front of me. I patiently read through the dozens of pages of the contract in my hands and looked up at him before setting my pen onto the paper. "Are you sure about this?" The man looked me in the eyes and answered calmly, without the slightest flinch or waver.
"I take full responsibility for all consequences.
"Even if you may regret it forever?"
This is our only chance. Peace for the majority at an insignificant cost. Black Swan leaves us no choice."
I fell silent, and the man didn't give me the opportunity to question it again.
"This is the second time I've made this decision."
He continued to speak in a calm voice.
"There's been no turning back ever since we took the first step."
I squeezed the pen so hard that the weight in my hand became almost unbearable. I took a deep breath and finally signed my name. I knew very well that there was no turning back. We had to move forward. When I signed the document, the man handed me a folder.
"Our first test subject."
I opened the folder straight away. I looked up at him in shock when I saw the name at the top of the page. Before I could say anything, he had already answered my question.
"The information is correct. He's the most suitable candidate right now."
"But—" I remained stunned.
"You can begin preparations. He'll be here soon. Then the NW plan will officially begin."
His expression remained emotionless, as if he was talking about no one of significance. But the tension in his body exposed his uneasiness. I suppressed the shock within and said no more. Back at the office, I opened the folder again and read through it carefully. Gavin, 24 years old, Evol, wind control. His Evol was awakened at the age of 17. His ability level tested as the highest 2 years ago. The young man in the photo was wearing a white STF uniform and looking sharply at the camera, while projecting a sense of pride and the subtlest hint of oppression. He was a determined person. This was the assessment I made. But would he retain his determination even after he was transformed? I couldn't tell, but I hoped he would. He was the man's son, after all. It was no easy task to restart a plan which had been suspended for decades. But no matter the difficulty, the plan had to proceed. A month later, with Black Swan's activities becoming more frequent, as the chief officer, the man led the team off base and returned with the first test subject as promised. The NW plan had officially restarted. Gavin stood quietly in the middle of the lab. His familiar eyes had me lost in thought for a moment, but I quickly suppressed my emotions and explained the first experiment and its possible side effects. He didn't react to the cruel procedures I spoke of, nor did he falter or show any signs of fear. He stood up straight with dried blood stains all over his body. Our eyes met once, but I quickly averted my gaze. Those eyes were shrouded in shadow, suppressing intense emotions, yet revealing a strange inner peace, as if he had fearlessly accepted his fate.
"Gavin, are you ready?"
The man who had been silent finally spoke. Gavin replied in an extremely cold voice.
"Yes."
The man then turned to look at me and nodded his head slightly.
"We can begin."
We had waited a long time for this experiment. The man left in a hurry before the experiment officially began. All steps were carried out methodically. Under the cold lights of the lab, Gavin was injected with a drug and submerged in a clear buffer liquid, with dozens of metal patches attached to his body, monitoring every subtle change in data. As the experiment proceeded, abnormalities soon occurred. The line on the ECG fluctuated less and less, until it finally flatlined after one last sudden vibration. It was like the last spark that was suddenly extinguished in the dark. Even though we were prepared for this, I still found my hands trembling when the moment came. A researcher informed me that Gavin's vital signs and evol fluctuations were about to disappear. All the data pointed to the cruel fact that the experiment was about to fail, and the young man would soon be pronounced dead. I pounded the wall to stop my fingers from shaking and directed everyone to take all available resuscitation measures. But 1 minute, 2 minutes had passed. His vital signs had completely disappeared. Gavin. I gazed in silence at the young man with his eyes closed, recalling the time when that old man first told me that name. Suddenly, the lines of the ECG fluctuated slightly. Someone cried out in shock. I watched the screen nervously. The fluctuations gradually grew stronger and finally returned to normal, as if some invisible hand had pulled him back from the edge of death. Everyone let out a deep sigh of relief. I took on the task of observing Gavin after the experiment. On the hospital bed, the pale-faced young man who had returned from the brink of death didn't relax his furrowed brows even in a coma. I sorted through his belongings. A phone that was turned off, a set of keys, an STF badge, and a photo that was placed on his chest. The slightly faded photo seemed to have been taken when the person was not aware. In the picture was a beautiful girl. I paused and placed this photo next to Gavin's pillow. Perhaps this way he would have sweet dreams. 1 week after the experiment, the circumstances were beyond what we could have anticipated. In the 32 hours after Gavin woke up, his mind plunged into chaos, while his modified evol went out of control, destroying the entire lab at one point. Fortunately, after a certain period of time, he recovered. But he had lost all his emotions and had become extremely cold. Just as we'd predicted, he became the most powerful weapon. The sounds of heavy crashes came through the closed door. My hand froze on the handle, and I waited a few minutes before pushing the door open. Gavin stood in the middle of the empty underground training room and looked at me with his indifferent eyes. Even though this had happened many times, my heart still leapt, and all the cells in my body tensed subconsciously, warning me that he was dangerous. I kept a certain distance and said to him, "You should adapt according to the plan we've developed." Gavin didn't respond. A black gust surrounded him, like a blade slashing through the walls and the ground and spreading through everything in the room. I wiped away the blood spilling from the new wounds on my face and silently increased my distance from him. Week after week, I watched in silence as he repeatedly depleted his evol, then waited to recover. It was an extremely painful process that was no different from breaking all your bones and waiting for them to grow back. This violent force often hurt him, leaving scars all over his body and drenching him in blood. "It's time to finish training for the day." I spoke up again to stop him. But my words were met with a piercing alarm. I was shocked to see that a blank space had appeared before Gavin. Everything in that area was gone. His evol had changed. It was a breakthrough that was slated to happen half a month later, according to the plan. This time, Gavin finally spoke.
"Someone's waiting for me."
This seemed to be his motivation, which could sometimes destroy a person, but could strengthen them as well. I didn't know who was waiting for him, or what kind of conviction he had that would sustain him through such a cruel plan. The NW plan, to stimulate the evol gene to its maximum potential, and forcibly develop the evol's power to its fullest extent in a short period of time. But it had obvious downsides. The test subject would very likely not be able to withstand the load, and when their evol reached its peak, it would inevitably face a decline. Gavin had gained far more power than expected after his transformation. None of us could predict what kind of decline he would face. Finally, Gavin stopped and sank down onto the steps, exhausted. I couldn't resist asking the question. Why did you agree to participate in the plan?
I need power.
He uttered the words without the slightest hesitation. Is power always a good thing?
Not for everyone.
I understood what he meant. He was more determined than we were to control this power. I was suddenly excited to see his future, even if the test subjects of the NW plan would only become weapons. And the future of weapons was only to destroy and be destroyed. 2 weeks after the experiment, the NW plan entered its final phase. We had gathered a substantial amount of data from Gavin, which would support the plan to proceed. Meanwhile, Black Swan was operating in plain sight again, which had forced us to speed up the plan and to set out in search of the next batch of test subjects. But this was extremely difficult. Test subjects must have strong will to survive the agony and temptation from this destructive power. In an unusual turn of events, Gavin came to me out of the blue. Looking at the document placed before me, I remained silent for a long time. If you're clear about the consequences, I'll sign it.
I am.
Gavin stood before me with unwavering determination in his eyes. Without further questions, I solemnly signed the document, agreeing to allow NW 717 into active duty. Since you insist on walking this path, I took out a pair of ordinary-looking black gloves and placed them on the table. These can help you control your power. Gavin froze slightly, looking a little surprised. But he didn't ask, and silently put on the black gloves, the leather fabric wrapping tightly around each of his fingers. A dark shadow flashed across his eyes as he stared at his hands. This kind of power shouldn't exist in the world, but it did due to a series of accidents. By the time I heard Gavin had returned from his mission, all the lab personnel had been evacuated. The assistant warned me in advance, but I insisted on showing up. Before my eyes was Gavin on the verge of collapse. His body curled, with his fist tightly clenched. His veins bulged as if bearing an unbearable clash. I knew very well what had caused this situation, which was precisely the consequence I had warned him about before he went on the mission. The drug used by the NW plan on test subjects was extraordinarily potent, and so were the repercussions before it fully integrated. At that moment, perhaps every blood vessel and every cell in his body was sending a sharp, agonizing signal to his pain receptors. That pain would be more than several times that of the initial experiment. You need pain relief. I took out a syringe to give him an injection.
No need.
Gavin didn't even look up and spoke in a tone that was perhaps calmer than mine. But there was an almost imperceptible tremor in his voice.
I've read your report. I need this opportunity.
He was betting on his only chance of survival. I respected his decision and replaced the needle with the final set of drugs for the experiment. I waited at a distance for the final result. Gavin remained silent. His breathing almost completely disappeared at some point. Only the data on the equipment displayed the dramatic changes happening in his body. I watched him all night, until Gavin finally stood up at the dawn of day. After remaining in the same posture for such a long time, his body staggered and almost toppled. I completed a full examination on him and found that he had succeeded in seizing this 1 in 1,000 chance. According to our plan, the completion of the transformation fluctuated at a maximum of 80%, which Gavin had far exceeded. I studied the final results and warned Gavin once more before he left. It could end up devouring you. Gavin's presence gave off an aura of danger, but his eyes were as calm as ice.
I can't go back.
This plan left no room for retreat. The success of Gavin's transformation signaled the expansion of the NW plan. I placed all the data and reports related to him in a folder and prepared for the upcoming experiment. As the NW plan progressed, the consequences that the modifications introduced gradually grew beyond our control. This led us to consider what should happen to the test subjects when everything was over. When asked about my plans for the future, I said I would probably find a place far away for a fresh start and spend the rest of my life in regret and repentance. As the first successful test subject, Gavin's decision came earlier than expected. When I reached the door of the chief's office, I saw a badge and the black gloves on the desk through the closing door. As we passed each other in the hallway, Gavin gave me a subtle nod. I handed something to him. It was his STF badge that was put away during his first experiment. Gavin seemed a little surprised, whispered a thank you, and then left without a second thought. I watched him as he left. His back was straight as he walked, and his footsteps gradually lightened. I saw him take out his phone to make a call, then disappeared as he rounded the corner of the corridor. I hoped this was the last time we saw each other. I thought to myself and pushed open the office door. The man stood by the window in silence, as if waiting for something. "Why did you choose to let Gavin go?" I asked. The man sat back down behind the desk. The NW symbol on the wall behind him seemed to cast the heaviest shadow looming over him. He said calmly,
I'm also a father, even though I'm not a good one.
He pulled open a secret drawer and took out a yellowed photo. I knew that it was the figure of someone who would forever remain in everyone's memory. I thought of the night when he learned of Wardia's death, and the child covered in thorns, resistance and despair written all over his face. What a long, heavy night it had been. But by the next day, the man had tucked away all his devastation, as if the pain I had seen was merely an illusion. The child at that time had grown up to the point where he could no longer be ignored. He became a powerful guardian, just as his mother had wished. For some reason, I suddenly said, "Actually, you two are very similar." The man immediately shook his head.
He's much better than me. Back when...
He seemed to have briefly fallen into deep thought and said no more. I didn't persist in this topic and gave him my full report of the final results of the NW project experiments. The original intention of this plan was to contain dangerous evolvers with absolute power, and to reduce the potential damage to ordinary people and evolvers. During the implementation of the plan, achieving this goal resulted in many inevitable problems. Perhaps now was the time to abort the plan. I waited for a long time for the man's announcement.
The NW plan will be officially terminated in 1 week.
This was the moment perhaps we had all been waiting for. I packed up the files and gave him a salute, and also paid tribute to all those who had given their lives for this project and for this world. Soon enough, this plan would be buried under the thick soil of history, never to be mentioned again, and only the twinkling stars above would continue to illuminate the long, long night